Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we wander together into a time when the cold could kill, when your best hope for surviving a winter night was a roof made of timber and thatch, a handful of smouldering embers, and a stubborn will to make it through until morning. We're going to slip quietly into the frozen hush of a medieval village, where snow piles against warped doors and the wind seems to carry voices older than memory. You'll feel the sting in your cheeks, the numb in your toes, and you'll wonder, would you actually make it through the night? Truth be told, you probably wouldn't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about knowing someone across the world is wrapped in a blanket at 2 a.m. just like you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first sensation that hits you is the air. It doesn't just feel cold, it feels alive, pressing sharp edges against your skin, sneaking into your lungs as if each breath is trying to freeze you from the inside out. Snow crunches beneath your boots as you trudge into the heart of the hamlet, and every cottage seems to sag under the weight of frost. The thatched roofs are brittle, glistening like glass in the moonlight. Each window, if you can call them that, glows faintly with the trembling light of tallow candles. A village asleep, or perhaps merely hiding from the wrath of midwinter. You push against the wind and find yourself muttering, half in awe and half in complaint, about how anyone managed this without central heating. Your jacket, let's be honest, it's polyester, modern, smugly smug. Feels like armour compared to the threadbare tunics of the peasants who lived here centuries ago. And yet, even with your advantage, your fingers are stiff, your nose running. The thought creeps in. These people didn't just fight hunger or plague or feudal lords, they wrestled with the night itself. A curious thing. Historians often note that medieval Europe endured what's called the Little Ice Age, a stretch of centuries when winters were harsher than today's, colder, longer, unforgiving. Not every year, not every place, but often enough to etch hardship into memory. The mainstream record tells us of rivers freezing solid, fairs held on the Thames, vineyards ruined by frosts. You imagine peasants bending low against snowdrifts that reach the height of their doors. And here you are, walking into their story, feeling the same bite. Somewhere in the shadows you think you hear a low moo, the shuffle of hooves. Even the animals, kept close by for survival, sound restless. You draw your cloak tighter, pretend it's made of rough wool rather than factory-spun softness, and wonder at the texture of that life. Because here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have unearthed old cooking pots blackened by centuries of smoke and soot, so clogged that it's obvious fires smouldered indoors almost constantly. The air must have been thick, acrid, your lungs scratching every inhale. But when frost rimed your eyebrows and water froze in its cup by the bed, smoky air was still preferable to icy air. You move toward the largest cottage, noticing how uneven the wood planks are, how the door hangs askew. A faint orange glow leaks from cracks like a promise. Pushing inside, you're greeted not by warmth exactly, but by a different quality of cold, muted, softened, wrapped in smoke and bodies. The villagers are asleep, huddled together in heaps of straw, children tucked under arms, dogs curled against legs. Breath steams upward, mingling into a thin fog beneath the rafters. You catch a glimpse of frost clinging to the inner beams, delicate crystals shimmering even in firelight. And this, you realise, is the nightly battlefield. Not against marauders, not against wolves, but against the temperature itself. Sleep is less about dreaming and more about survival. You notice the fire is nearly embers, smouldering faintly. Wood is precious. Every log used tonight is one fewer for tomorrow. A peasant has to weigh comfort now against survival later. That calculation hums quietly in the room, even if no one voices it. Some scholars argue about just how miserable these nights were. There's debate over whether peasants adapted so thoroughly that they barely noticed, or whether every night was a fresh trial of endurance. Some evidence suggests layered clothing and bed sharing dulled the worst of the cold, making it bearable. Others point to frostbite scars on skeletal remains as proof that exposure was no small threat. Historians still wrestle with these questions. piecing together clues from written records, bones, and even the pollen trapped in old timbers. And you, here in this smoky cottage, don't need a debate. You feel the truth in your bones. The hush is profound. Outside, the wind lashes snow against walls, but inside, only the occasional cough, the shifting of straw, or the sigh of a restless sleeper breaks the quiet. You can't help but smile wryly at how romanticised the simple life sometimes sounds. Imagine someone from the 21st century swooning over rustic charm, only to wake up scratching flea bites and chipping ice off their beard. Pastoral bliss, they'd call it, until the chamber pot freezes solid. You step carefully, your boots sinking into the uneven floor. The dirt is frozen hard, packed tight with centuries of trampling feet. Near the hearth lies a bundle of twigs saved as kindling, a pitiful defence against a week of icy nights. You wonder at the ingenuity required to stretch such meagre supplies. Children sent to scavenge brush, women drying dung for fuel, men bartering with neighbours for a few extra logs. Every ember is precious, every ember is life. You glance again at the sleeping heap of humanity, and for a moment you envy them. Not the fleas, not the smoke, not the constant ache of cold, but the closeness. Their warmth is communal, their survival a shared pact. In a world where walls are thin and death is common, there's no such thing as solitude. You're reminded that for them, winter wasn't just endured, it was lived together, and perhaps that's the lesson lingering in the frost. You could face the cold alone, or you could press shoulder to shoulder and outlast it as one. There's a story, almost whispered in the village memory, about a boy who once tried to sleep apart. Decided he'd had enough of being elbowed, of sharing straw with snoring cousins and clucking hens. He dragged his blanket into a corner, built himself a tiny nest, and declared freedom. By morning his teeth rattled so violently he could barely speak, and his mother hauled him back into the heap without a word. Independence might be a virtue in fair weather, but here, in the frozen guts of January, warmth was always a group project. And isn't that, in its own bleak way, a kind of poetry? The night outside might be savage, but inside the smoke-choked hut, there is resilience stitched together from scraps of hay, smouldering logs and stubborn hearts. You look once more at the rafters glittering with frost, and you realise this is only the beginning of the night. You lean against the crooked doorway, feeling the icy air seep through cracks you didn't even know were there. The cottage you stand in is a patchwork of wood, daub and wishful thinking, built not for comfort but for bare survival. Outside, the wind continues its relentless howl, squeezing through gaps in the timber frame, rattling loose shutters, and carrying a powder of snow right across the threshold. Inside, it's a perpetual tug-of-war between warmth and exposure. The fire's weak glow pitted against the cunning fingers of the frost. You glance up, and the walls themselves seem to shiver. These huts weren't engineered with insulation in mind. They were thrown together from what could be gathered. Rough timbers, wattle woven with sticks, smeared over with daub made of clay, straw and dung. Effective on paper, sure, but after years of settling, warping and rotting, the walls became more suggestion than barrier. And when the temperature plummeted, every draught turned into a whispering reminder that you were little more than a guest in the elements' domain. The mainstream fact historians often emphasise is that medieval peasants' homes were single-room affairs, small enough to heat quickly, but just as quick to lose that heat again. You'd think compactness would work in their favour, but with no insulation, thin walls, and a floor of cold earth, warmth drained faster than it could be made. Archaeological reconstructions show evidence of hearths placed centrally, with smoke simply escaping through the thatch above or tiny louvered openings. A marvel of ventilation, if you like irony, since the same gaps that carried smoke away also funneled cold air inside. You run your hand along one of the beams, feeling splinters catch on your skin. The timber is rough, unpolished, and older than the village itself, darkened with centuries of smoke. You imagine a family leaning against it, backs to the wind, hoping the wall's meagre thickness would spare them a fraction of warmth. And yet, here's a curious tidbit for you. Some villages deliberately left openings at the top of walls, not just for smoke, but for the belief that stagnant air was unhealthy. Better to let the cold gusts in than risk bad humours swirling around the sleeping family. You can almost hear their ancestors chuckling, saying, "See? We weren't freezing, we were cleansing the air." Your eyes wander to the corners, where frost blooms like white moss, creeping down from the roof beams. The draught is so constant that even the shadows quiver. In one corner, a sleeping child pulls his wool hood tighter, curling into his mother's side. The little one's breath fogs in rhythm, faint clouds rising and dissolving. You crouch closer to the hearth, watching embers flicker low, but even here the air feels restless, never still. The cold presses in from every angle, like a predator circling its prey. Historians still argue whether these huts were truly miserable, or whether peasants accepted them as normal, their senses dulled by routine. Some accounts suggest that after generations of exposure, their tolerance for cold far exceeded ours, that a draughty cottage felt cosy compared to the open fields. Others counter that written complaints from the time describe the cold in tones familiar to anyone who's had to sit through a winter power outage. The debate swirls as steadily as the drafts themselves, leaving you to decide, are you a pampered modern softling, or are you genuinely justified in muttering about the chill? The fire sputters. Sparks leap and vanish in the dark, and you hear a faint scratching. It's the wind clawing at shutters. You step closer to the window, though calling it a window is generous. It's a hole cut into the wall, framed with rough planks, and fitted with a wooden shutter barely hinged. A scrap of cloth dangles, stiff with frost, once used to block the gap but now more like brittle paper than fabric. Each time the wind hits, the shutter rattles, the cloth flaps, and the room shivers as if it too feels the night's bite. It strikes you that draughty isn't just an adjective here, it's a condition of existence. A medieval peasant might tuck hay into cracks, hang blankets across doors, or stack firewood against outer walls as crude insulation. Still, every attempt was a losing game. The air moved freely, slipping in, tugging at blankets, caressing necks with icy fingers. Perhaps that's why people wore layers indoors, sleeping in tunics, cloaks, even boots when the cold was at its worst. Bed was no private luxury. It was a cocoon against drafts, a last defence when walls betrayed you. A joke sneaks into your mind. How modern real estate ads would sell this place. Rustic, open-plan living space with natural ventilation and authentic historical character. Great fixer-upper. You chuckle quietly, careful not to disturb the sleepers, though the idea of paying extra for draft seems absurd. Still, you can't help but admire the stubbornness of people who thrived in this setting, who woke each day ready to farm, to trade, to endure, despite never having felt the embrace of a sealed, insulated home. You shift to the doorway again, listening to the symphony of draughts. It's a sound you've never paid attention to before. Tiny whistles through cracks, the creak of beams shifting against the wind, the flutter of that cloth shutter. Each note is a reminder of vulnerability. Yet for these villagers, it was simply background music to life. If you grew up with draughts from the moment you opened your eyes, maybe you'd stop noticing, just as city dwellers today stop noticing sirens or car horns. Perhaps cold is easier to bear when it's a constant rather than a surprise. Still, it isn't without cost. You imagine rheumatism setting into joints too young for stiffness, chilblains on children's fingers, fevers sparked by nights too cold to fight. The draughts don't just make people uncomfortable, they shape their bodies, their health, their resilience. Every cough that echoes through the night could be the start of something more worsened by exposure. The very architecture of these huts, humble as they were, became accomplices to winter's bite. You look again at the hut as a whole, seeing not failure but compromise. Timber was precious, stone too costly, so the hut was built quickly, simply with resources at hand. The drafts weren't desired, but they were tolerated because survival wasn't about comfort. It was about making it to spring. And for all the flaws you see, you recognise something else. These huts lasted. Some stood for generations, patched, repaired, leaned on by family after family. Their draftiness was as much a part of life as hunger or prayer, a condition endured, joked about, perhaps even cursed under breath, but lived with nonetheless. You step back out into the night, where the wind slaps your face in greeting, almost as if mocking you for seeking shelter in a hut barely warmer than the open sky. And yet, even in its flaws, that hut is defiance. A thin, smoky bubble holding back the cold, a fragile fortress cobbled together by hands that refuse to yield. For all its draughts, for all its splinters and rattles, it stands, and that, you realise, is enough. You duck back into the hut, because as pitiful as it feels, the warmth of a dwindling fire is still better than facing the wild bite of the night air outside. The hearth sits in the middle of the room, just a circle of stones scorched black by centuries of flame. It isn't the roaring blaze of a modern fireplace or the dependable hum of central heating. It's a shallow pit with a few stubborn coals glowing faintly red, like a heart beating weakly through exhaustion. Smoke curls upward, too lazy to rise straight, lingering just long enough to make your eyes sting before drifting out through a hole in the thatch. You crouch by the embers, rubbing your hands together. The heat here is teasing, never steady. One moment it licks your palms, the next it retreats as if pulled back into hiding. The family around you knows this rhythm well. Firewood is scarce, gathered during long summer days and hoarded carefully through the year. Every log burned tonight is one less chance to ward off frost tomorrow. The glow is rationed, just like bread or ale, and you feel the weight of each crackle as if it were a coin spent. Mainstream accounts remind us that the hearth was the centre of medieval life, not just for cooking, not just for warmth, but as the heart of the household itself. You can see why. Everything revolves around it. The family clusters here, animals sometimes nuzzle close, and even conversations are framed by its weak light. It's the closest thing to a television screen of the Middle Ages, only instead of flickering with endless shows, it flickers with necessity. You stare at the embers as if they hold secrets, because to peasants, they really did. The fire meant survival. Let it die, and the night wins. As you watch, a woman stirs in the straw heap, dragging herself up to feed the fire. She reaches for a bundle of twigs, thin and brittle, and lays them carefully on the coals. The crackle is immediate, a hiss like defiance, and a brief tongue of flame leaps up, casting long shadows across the uneven walls. For a heartbeat, the room looks alive again, the beams glowing like they've caught sunlight. Then the flame dwindles, retreating back to a glow. Here's a quirky detail that makes you smirk. Some peasants carried live embers from house to house in covered pots, lending flame to neighbours too poor or too unlucky to spark their own. Imagine knocking on a friend's door not to borrow sugar but to borrow fire itself, cupping your hands around a clay jar as if you carried gold. It was communal life at its most practical and at its most precarious. One bad frost, one careless night, and the entire rhythm of warmth could falter. You settle back onto your haunches and feel the smoke cling to your clothes. It's acrid, sharp, the kind of scent that refuses to wash out. Your lungs ache with every breath. It's no wonder respiratory problems ran rampant in these communities. Even some medieval chroniclers complained of smoke-heavy rooms, where eyes watered constantly and ceilings turned black. You cough softly, half sympathy and half reality. Comfort here is always bartered. You can have heat, but only if you accept smoke. You can keep the cold at bay, but your lungs will pay for it later. Historians still puzzle over how peasants managed long-term health in such conditions. Some argue their bodies simply acclimated, becoming tolerant of smoke in ways we can hardly imagine. Others suggest it contributed significantly to shorter life expectancies, that each smoky breath was another invisible tax on vitality. No single answer satisfies, because written records are sparse, skeletal remains offer only hints, and daily resilience leaves few obvious marks. Yet in this hut, as the fire sputters and the family shifts in their straw, you realise the mystery doesn't need solving. The evidence is written in the sting of your eyes. You glance around the circle of sleepers. The faint light casts them in shades of red and gold, their faces half lit, half hidden. It's strangely intimate, almost tender, the way the glow softens the roughness of their features. A father's calloused hand rests protectively over a child's shoulder. A dog's muzzle twitches in a dream. A mother's hair glints faintly with firelight as she exhales. The hearth binds them all together in this fragile cocoon, even if the cocoon is leaky, smoky, and unsteady. There's a story told in some villages, half legend, half memory, of nights when the fire died completely. A family would wake shivering, their breath sharp in the air, and one brave soul would trudge barefoot through snow to the nearest neighbour's hut, carrying a pot to beg for embers. If no one had flame left, then flint and steel had to be struck, sparks coaxed desperately into life. The silence of such a night, waiting for fire to catch, must have been terrifying, a pause where the cold seemed to lick its lips. It makes you think how different modern worries are. We fret about Wi-Fi dropping or our phones dying overnight. They fretted about the fire dying, full stop. The stakes weren't inconvenience, they were survival. and oddly you find a certain respect for that. Their entire rhythm of life demanded attention to details we now ignore. Fire wasn't background, it was focus. You stretch your hands one more time over the coals, but the warmth barely reaches your fingers. Even here, even at the hearth, the cold has a seat at the table. The faint glow is defiant, but never victorious. You can almost hear winter chuckling outside the walls, knowing it has patience on its side. And yet, despite it all, the peasants endure. The glow may be faint, but it's theirs. It's a stubborn heartbeat that says, we are not finished yet. And so you sit with them, smoke in your lungs, frost at your back, firelight on your face, sharing in the fragile, flickering miracle of surviving one more night. You edge away from the hearth now, smoke clinging stubbornly to your clothes and hair, and your eyes drift toward the real bed of the house, or rather, what passed for one. No carved wood frame, no feather-stuffed mattress, no neat stack of pillows embroidered with initials. Instead, a heap of straw lies in the shadow of the wall, spread over the hard earth floor and covered here and there with ragged scraps of cloth, bits of old wool, or whatever sacks could be spared from hauling grain. It doesn't look inviting. In fact, it looks scratchy, uneven, the kind of surface you'd associate with barn animals rather than human rest. And yet, this is where the family collapses each night, curling into the straw with exhaustion so profound that discomfort hardly matters. The smell hits you before the feel does. A sour, sweet tang of dried grass mingled with smoke, sweat, and the unmistakable musky odour of too many unwashed bodies pressed together. Still, in this place, smell is secondary to survival. You crouch low and touch the straw. It prickles your fingertips, brittle and stiff, some pieces splintering like tiny needles. Imagine trying to sleep on it bare-skinned. You wince at the thought. But here's the reality. Most peasants did. At best, a coarse linen sheet or a tattered blanket might have been stretched across the heap, softening the worst of the pokes. More often, you simply lay down in your tunic, boots on, cloak wrapped tight, and surrendered to the itch. Mainstream historical descriptions remind us that bedding for peasants was basic and communal. Families didn't each have separate beds. They shared all together side by side in the straw. Parents, children, even servants might pile into the same space, not for affection necessarily, but for body heat. In the dead of winter, the warmth of another person next to you mattered far more than notions of privacy or comfort. In fact, the phrase to make the bed often meant nothing more than gathering straw and rearranging it into a slightly less lumpy pile before lying down. You lower yourself further, letting your weight sink into the heap. Immediately the sharp ends jab your ribs and thighs. Flecks of dust rise, tickling your nose, and you sneeze, loud enough to make one of the children stir and grumble before curling tighter against his mother. And then you notice them, little black specks crawling lazily through the stalks. Fleas. Of course, the true rulers of the medieval bed. These tiny tyrants made their homes in the straw, feeding on warm blood whenever they pleased. Entire families slept not just beside each other, but beside colonies of pests that carried more than just discomfort. They carried disease. And here's a quirky tidbit to file away. Some households, knowing the inevitability of infestation, deliberately scattered aromatic herbs like mint, lavender, or tansy through their straw. Not only did it make the bed smell faintly more pleasant, but certain plants were thought to repel insects. The results? Mixed at best. Fleas, it turns out, are stubborn tenants. Still, a bed that smelled of herbs might at least feel a little less like lying in a barn. You can almost imagine a medieval housewife shaking out a bundle of tansy with a sigh, muttering, "Well, it can't make things worse." The longer you linger here, the more you understand the paradox of this space. It is deeply uncomfortable by modern standards, yet strangely intimate by theirs. The straw bed is where life happened. Families whispered here, children nursed here, stories and songs carried across the dark hours while the wind rattled the shutters. It was a stage as much as a mattress. You glance at the bundle of figures, legs tangled, arms draped, and realise this is more than a bed. It's a human knot, woven as tightly as the thatch overhead, designed not for beauty, but for survival. Historians still dispute how widespread true mattresses were for common folk. Some argue that better-off peasants used tick mattresses, cloth sacks filled with straw, feathers if they were lucky, which could be shaken and refilled. Others claim the majority simply spread straw loose on the ground. Archaeological digs have uncovered remnants of both, leaving the truth blurred. Perhaps it varied village to village, or family to family. In either case, what remains constant is the communal nature of the bed. The medieval night was not private, it was collective. You lie back fully now, stretching out in the straw heap. The roof beams loom above you, etched with frost. The hearth glows faintly across the room. To your right, a child breathes softly, his face smudged with ash. To your left, a grandmother snores gently, a rhythm as steady as the wind outside. Somewhere beneath your shoulder, something wriggles. A mouse, perhaps, sharing the warmth. You resist the urge to leap up and instead let yourself sink into the experience. This, you realise, is what it meant to sleep in the Middle Ages, surrendering to imperfection, pressing into family and animal alike, closing your eyes not because you were comfortable, but because you were too exhausted to care. A thought sneaks in. Imagine trying to pitch this as a heritage experience to modern travellers. Authentic medieval bed, share straw with strangers, wake up scratching, and breathe in real 14th century smoke. You laugh quietly, though the humour turns to a cough when dust hits your throat. Still, you can't deny there's a certain raw honesty here. Nothing curated, nothing polished, just life as it was lived. Itchy, noisy, smelly, but stubbornly enduring. The bed shifts as the family stirs in their sleep. One child rolls onto another, prompting a muffled protest. The father pulls his cloak tighter, tugging it over the little ones. The mother adjusts her position so the baby can nestle closer, and through it all you sense a quiet resilience. The straw bed may be rough, but it binds them together. It's where laughter and lullabies linger, where survival is practiced night after night, and when the snow lies thick outside and the wind claws at every crack, there is no greater weapon than warmth shared in the scratchy embrace of straw. You close your eyes for just a moment, letting the smells and sounds wash over you. The hay, the smoke, the soft snoring, the faint scratching of pests. It isn't comfortable, not by any stretch, but it's profoundly human. And as the night deepens, you realise this shared bed, humble as it is, carries the weight of countless winters, countless families, countless nights where survival meant pressing close and trusting straw and skin alike to hold off the cold. You stir in the scratchy straw, brushing a flea from your wrist, when suddenly a low snort ripples through the room. Not human. Your head jerks up and there it is, a cow shifting in the corner, its massive flank pressed against the wall, its breath steaming in the frigid air. A goat bleats softly nearby, then curls its legs under its body and settles into a lump of warmth. Chickens cluck once or twice, shifting their claws against the frozen floor before tucking their heads back under their wings. The realization strikes you fully now. This is not just a bedroom. This is a barn. And yet, that's not an insult. It's a strategy. In the bitter months, animals came inside not merely for their own safety, but for the heat they gave off. Each body was a little furnace, each exhale another puff of warmth trapped beneath the thatched roof. It may not sound like much, but in a drafty hut where a fire could sputter out before dawn, the difference between freezing and surviving might just be measured in the presence of a cow's flank radiating heat beside you. The mainstream historical record makes no secret of this practice. Peasant houses, particularly in northern Europe, often had no separate byre or stable. Instead, livestock lived under the same roof, sometimes divided only by a low wooden partition, sometimes with no division at all. The layout of these longhouses could stretch from hearth to stall, with humans and animals arranged like mismatched roommates. To us, it seems unthinkable. To them, it was efficient. Manure could be collected more easily for fields, animals were less likely to be stolen by raiders or wolves, and most importantly, the warmth of beasts mingled with human breath to keep the killing frost at bay. You shuffle closer to the cow, feeling the radiant heat from its body. It smells earthy, pungent, layered with hay and dung. Not pleasant, but oddly grounding. You imagine curling against it like a living radiator, your cloak spread across its back, your fingers buried in its fur. Children likely did this without hesitation, too weary from the day's work to care about smell or propriety. For them, comfort came in unexpected shapes, and if that comfort moved, so be it. Here's a curious tidbit that might surprise you. There are records of chickens being placed under beds in winter, their feathery bodies generating enough warmth to stave off frost creeping up from the ground. Dogs, of course, were treasured companions, curled faithfully against feet or legs. Cats, while less interested in service, often prowled near beds for warmth and pest control alike. The medieval hot water bottle, if you like, was alive, squawking, purring, or wagging its tail. But the intimacy of this arrangement wasn't universally praised. Some chroniclers sniffed disapprovingly, describing peasants as living like beasts because they shared roofs with animals. For the elite, separation was a mark of status. Proper barns for cattle, proper chambers for people. Yet down in the thatched villages such criticism was irrelevant. Let the nobles sneer in their stone halls. Here, in the flicker of firelight, warmth mattered more than dignity. And if your sheep was part of your family's nightly defence, then the sheep stayed inside. Historians still debate the degree of integration between humans and animals indoors. Some argue that longhouses were carefully divided, animals on one end, people on the other, with airflow designed to carry manure fumes away from sleeping families. Others insist that in poorer households, partitions were minimal and the stench was constant. Archaeological remains show traces of both, leaving the reality somewhere in between. You glance at the hut around you, with its single smoky room, and suspect the poorer version is closer to the truth. You lie back in the straw again, listening. The soundscape is different now that you notice the animals. A cow's jaw working slowly over cud, a goat's muffled bleat, the faint scratching of claws against wood. These are not just noises, they're lullabies of survival. To a medieval ear, silence might have meant danger, animals too cold, too sick, or too dead to stir. Noise, smell, heat, all of it was reassurance. Life was still pulsing in the room. Of course, living this way came with hazards. Disease spread easily in such close quarters, from livestock to humans. Fleas from chickens, worms from pigs, respiratory troubles from the sheer weight of manure fumes. And yet you suspect the peasants weighed these dangers against the certainty of frostbite outside and decided the trade-off was worth it. Better a cough in spring than a frozen corpse in winter. You try to imagine telling someone from today's world about this arrangement. Yes, I sleep with my family, 3 kids, 2 dogs, and a cow in one room. The look on their face would be priceless. They'd assume poverty, desperation, disaster. But here, it was life as usual. It was routine. It was the nightly ritual of peasants everywhere, repeated generation after generation until it became almost invisible, hardly worth remarking on. The cow shifts again, releasing a deep breath that warms your cheek. For a fleeting moment, it feels almost comforting. You laugh softly at yourself, realizing you've grown accustomed to the presence of your new bedfellows. Maybe this is the secret of medieval winter nights. The strangeness of sleeping beside animals fades, and what remains is the shared warmth of beings, human and beast alike, enduring the same cold together. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling the heat of the cow at your side, the straw crackling faintly beneath you, the chickens rustling overhead. The hut is still draughty, still smoky, still uncomfortable, but with every breath, every snort, every shuffle of hoof and claw, it feels a little less lonely, and that perhaps was the true gift of sharing space with animals, not only their warmth, but their presence. A reminder that life was not facing the winter alone, but facing it together, across species, under the same roof. The first light of dawn hasn't arrived yet, and already you're aware of the weight pressing down on you. Not the weight of responsibility, though that too exists in spades, but the sheer physical burden of fabric. Cloaks, tunics, scraps of wool, a patched blanket, and perhaps an old sack or two have all been piled across your body in the eternal battle with the cold. The straw beneath scratches your skin, but the layers on top smother it, creating a cocoon not of comfort but of necessity. You shift slightly, and the pile rustles. It's a sound like dead leaves being stirred. Coarse, dry, a little mournful. A child beside you burrows deeper, dragging a fraying bit of wool higher over her chin. The wool is itchy, dense, and smells faintly of lanolin, but it holds warmth better than linen alone. And linen, though softer, is the underlayer everyone clings to. Close to the skin, linen was supposed to wick away sweat and provide a barrier against the abrasive bite of wool. Even now your shirt clings rough against your shoulders, its weave uneven but strong, made to survive wash after wash in cold streams. The mainstream record reminds us that textiles were treasures. Wool dominated peasant wardrobes across much of Europe because sheep were abundant, their fleece renewable, their usefulness beyond measure. Spun into thread, woven into cloth, cut into tunics, or stitched into cloaks, wool was the medieval answer to winter's cruelty. Linen, drawn from flax, took more labour, more care, but was equally essential. Together, they created a wardrobe strategy. Layers upon layers, trapping air, holding heat, staving off frost. The bed at night was merely an extension of the clothing strategy. Sleep in your tunic, cloak and boots if you had to, because shedding layers was a luxury no one could afford in January. As you tug one cloak tighter, you notice the uneven stitches. Someone's hand worked this by candlelight, patching holes with whatever thread could be found. A different colour here, a thicker weave there. It's a tapestry of repairs, each one a small act of survival. There's a beauty in the imperfection, a story told in every mend. It makes you think of a quirky little tidbit. In some places, peasants were buried in the same patched garments they had worn for years, their clothes so valued that stripping them for new cloth was seen as an insult. That tunic you sleep in might literally be your last, and so you clung to it night after night, year after year. The hut is still cold, of course. Frost laces the rafters, and drafts curl across the floor like invisible snakes. But you notice how the layers blunt the bite. Heat rises from your own body, caught by wool, slowed by linen, pulled beneath the pile of cloth. It's not cosy, exactly, but it's survivable. Each added garment, each scrap of fabric, is another line of defence against the encroaching chill. You realise, too, how much effort must have gone into producing these layers, shearing sheep, carding wool, spinning yarn, weaving cloth. Each blanket is months of labour, each cloak a triumph of endurance before it ever touched your shoulders. Historians still wrestle with the details of textile access. Some argue that peasants, especially in wealthier regions, had enough wool to clothe their families decently, even fashionably at times. Others insist poverty meant layers were scarce, with families sharing blankets, rotating garments, and shivering through nights half-covered. Archaeological finds of worn textile fragments don't tell the full story, leaving scholars to squabble over whether the average peasant's winter bed was heavy with layers or desperately lacking them. In truth, it likely depended on harvests, flocks, and fortune. For some, a pile of wool might make the difference between life and death. For others, scraps barely covered knees. You turn slightly, the weight shifting with you, and think of how modern life romanticizes cosy blankets. Woolen throws sold in glossy catalogues, linen sheets praised for their softness, layering marketed as lifestyle choice rather than survival tactic. Imagine telling those medieval peasants that people in the future would buy expensive, distressed wool for aesthetic reasons. They'd likely laugh, or curse, at the absurdity. For them, every scrap had meaning, every patch mattered, every stitch represented time stolen from sleep. The child beside you whimpers in her dreams, kicking the blanket loose. Without hesitation, her mother reaches out, drags it back over her and tucks it tight. The gesture is automatic, practiced. She knows the danger of uncovered skin in this cold. Even indoors, exposure is risky. You sense the quiet vigilance at play. The family may rest, but some part of them is always alert, always aware of the balance between warmth and cold, between breath and frost. Your mind drifts to a story you once heard about a village where women spun yarn through the long winter nights, their fingers numb but relentless, determined to clothe their children against the cold. They joked that the whir of spinning wheels was the song of survival, a lullaby not sung but spun. You can almost hear it in the dark hut, the phantom echo of labour turned into fabric, fabric turned into life. And as the night deepens, you lie motionless under the layers, grateful for their scratchy, weighty presence. They may itch, they may smell, they may lack the elegance of silk or fur, but they are shields. Shields against a world that howls just beyond the door. And in that realization, you feel a grudging warmth, not from the fire, not from the straw, but from the knowledge that human hands, through patient, exhausting craft, built these barriers stitch by stitch, thread by thread, as stubborn refusals to let the cold win. The night stretches long, and with it comes the quiet shifting of bodies. You feel a tug at your arm as a child rolls closer, pressing their cold toes against your side. Instinctively you adjust, wrapping your arm around them, pulling the cloak tighter to trap whatever heat exists. Soon, another body edges closer, then another, until you are firmly wedged in a heap of limbs and breaths. This is not affection in the modern romantic sense. This is survival. Welcome to the medieval art of cuddling. In a world where beds were straw and drafts were relentless, the most efficient furnace was the human body itself. Alone you would lose heat too quickly, your breath rising in pale clouds and dispersing uselessly into the smoky rafters. Together you create a microclimate, a warm bubble in which each person becomes both heater and heated. You can feel the truth of it instantly. The chill still lingers, but it no longer cuts to the bone. Heat radiates in all directions, layered by skin, wool, and breath. Mainstream histories note how common this was. Not just families, but servants, apprentices, and travellers were often welcomed into shared beds. Privacy, that modern invention, had little place here. Space was precious, fuel limited, and warmth communal. To share a bed was not scandalous, it was expected. Only the wealthy could afford separate chambers and still more costly fires. For everyone else, bodies piled together in tangled heaps, indifferent to propriety, attentive only to the cold. You roll slightly, and a goat nudges closer, bleating softly as if to protest your movement. Apparently even animals understood the logic. The family dog curls at your feet, paws twitching in some dream, and the mother on your left exhales a sigh of relief when her baby's tiny hand is pressed between two adult bodies, shielded by warmth on either side. In this moment you're less a collection of individuals and more a living quilt stitched together by necessity. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval sayings mocked loners who tried to sleep apart, likening them to fools who chose to fight winter naked. In folk tales, the wise always slept in groups, while the proud who refused were punished with frost or illness. It was a cultural reinforcement of what nature already taught: cuddle or freeze. Even in ballads, shared beds are often described without shame, sometimes as comic, sometimes as pragmatic, but rarely as scandalous unless lust was implied. You think about how strange this sounds to us, conditioned as we are to value personal space. Modern mattresses are measured in inches of separation: queen, king, California king. Spaces designed for couples to share but still keep distance. Here, distance is unthinkable. The tighter, the better. The closer, the warmer. You chuckle at the thought of a medieval parent telling a modern visitor, "You want your own bed? What are you, a noble?" Historians still debate how many people would crowd into one straw bed at a time. Some accounts suggest entire extended families, 3 generations under one thatch, pressed together like sardines. Others believe it was limited to nuclear households, with servants perhaps finding space elsewhere. Archaeological evidence doesn't provide head counts, so the argument continues. Were medieval beds packed beyond reason, or merely shared by necessity? As you lie here, pinned between a grandmother and a goat, you suspect the truth leaned toward the crowded version. The intimacy is undeniable. You feel each rise and fall of breath, hear each snore and cough, smell each body. The air is thick with humanity, rank at times, but also reassuring. Alone, the sounds of the night, the rattling shutters, the distant howl of wolves might rattle the nerves. Together, the chorus of sleepers drowns the fear. The body heat soothes, the presence comforts, and even the child's restless kicks remind you that you're not alone in the fight against the cold. There's a story whispered by the grandmother as the little ones drift off, a half-prayer, half-lullaby about St. Martin, who shared his cloak with a beggar. She tells it softly, her voice rasping, the words blending with the rhythm of breath. You realise the moral is as practical as it is spiritual. Share what you have, because warmth divided is warmth multiplied. The children sigh contentedly, not because the tale is grand, but because it matches the reality they live nightly. You let your eyes close and feel the press of bodies on every side. There is no room to stretch, no possibility of turning without bumping into someone. And yet, the collective warmth lulls you in ways a solitary bed never could. Modern comfort, with its firm mattresses and down duvets, offers luxury. This heap offers survival, and oddly, a kind of solidarity that luxury can't match. You belong here, in this temporary fortress of skin and straw, because the cold cannot touch what is bound so tightly together. You think briefly, mischievously, of how this might play out as a trend today. Imagine influencers promoting authentic medieval group cuddling retreats, touting benefits of shared warmth and collective bonding. The image makes you grin in the dark, though the smell of goat quickly breaks the charm. Still, you can't deny that something primal stirs here. A reminder that human beings, for most of history, fought the elements not with walls or machines, but with each other. As the night drags on, your body relaxes into the shared warmth. It isn't comfortable, but it's survivable. And more than that, it's strangely tender. A living testament to the resilience of people who, without technology or modern comforts, found the simplest of solutions to the fiercest of problems. Press close, breathe deep, and endure the cold together. The night presses on, and though the bundle of bodies around you creates a pocket of warmth, there's no escaping the soft hiss of wind that snakes across the room. Your eyes follow its path, tracing the draft back to its source, a rectangular hole cut into the wall. Calling it a window feels generous. It is a void, a gap, a promise to the outside world that no matter how hard the family tries, the cold will always find its way inside. The shutter is little more than a slab of wood hung crookedly on crude hinges. It trembles with every gust, rattling like a loose tooth, as if it could be yanked out of place at any moment. A scrap of fabric, stiff with frost, has been nailed along the edges in an attempt to block the wind. The cloth doesn't succeed. It flaps like the tongue of a dog panting in the gale. Snowflakes creep in at the corners, gathering in little piles that sparkle faintly in the firelight before melting into mud. You sit up slightly, pulling the cloak around your shoulders, and study the frame. It's warped, uneven, and stained with soot. The peasants here never imagined glass panes shimmering with sunlight. Glass was for cathedrals and the houses of the elite. For common folk, windows were holes to let smoke out and light in, closed only when the outside threatened too much intrusion. At night, in winter, those holes were battlegrounds against the air itself. Mainstream records describe how many cottages had no true windows at all, relying instead on open vents in the roof or wall. Where windows did exist, coverings were crude. Wooden shutters, cloth soaked in oil or wax to stiffen it, or even parchment stretched thin. Imagine sleeping beneath parchment. Animal skin scraped until translucent, a pale substitute for glass. It let in a muted glow by day, but at night it was just another thin layer between you and the howl of the world. You lean closer, running your fingers along the edge of the shutter. The wood is cold enough to burn your skin, and you quickly recoil. The sensation reminds you that here, even touch is treacherous. You picture the daily ritual of sealing this window hole at dusk, pulling the shutter tight, hammering in wedges, stuffing cracks with straw or rags. Each gesture a small plea. Stay out, winter. Not tonight. Here's a quirky tidbit that might surprise you. Some peasants hung animal hides over their windows in the coldest months, the fur side inward, creating a crude but effective insulation. A cowhide stretched across the frame turned the hole into a kind of leathery shield, the fur holding heat while still allowing a faint trickle of air. It wasn't perfect. It reeked, it darkened the room, but it dulled the bite of the draught. Imagine lying beneath your cloak, staring at the flickering fur-covered wall, half asleep, half convinced the hide might come alive in the shadows. Historians still debate how much of a difference these makeshift coverings really made. Some argue that cloth and parchment barriers were laughably ineffective, more symbolic than practical. Others point to accounts of improved comfort, where even a thin hide reduced drafts enough to matter. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. Small gains that felt enormous when measured in degrees of survival. After all, in a room where a single ember could mean the difference between frostbite and health, any reduction in cold, however modest, was treasured. The draught rattles again, whistling softly as it squeezes through. You close your eyes and imagine how it must have felt to lie here centuries ago, knowing every gust could undo hours of hard work. Firewood hoarded, straw stuffed, cloaks layered, and still the wind finds you. There's something humbling in that inevitability. No matter how clever the fixes, nature always held the upper hand. The family stirs in their sleep, murmuring as the cold brushes their faces. One child pulls the blanket higher. The father grunts and shifts his weight. Even in slumber, their bodies respond to the window's betrayal. It is a constant presence, a reminder that walls are porous, that comfort is fragile. You wonder if, in their dreams, they ever imagined a house without drafts, a place where windows sealed tight, where warmth lingered instead of fleeing. Your modern brain can't help but think of double-glazed glass, of storm windows, of plastic insulation sheets taped in the fall. You almost laugh, imagining the absurdity of explaining weather stripping to these people. They'd nod politely, then return to stuffing straw in the gaps. The ingenuity is the same, only the tools differ. Both are acts of defiance against the same enemy, winter itself. The shutter rattles one last time, louder than before, and you swear it might fly open. But it holds. The fabric flaps once, twice, then stills. For now, the window hole has done its job, not perfectly, not comfortably, but well enough. And in this place, well enough is survival. You lie back into the straw, listening to the faint whistle of drafts weaving their way through the hut. It is a lullaby of sorts, harsh but constant, like the voice of the season itself humming at your ear, and as your eyes grow heavy again, you realise every medieval night was a conversation with the wind, carried through shutters, hides, and cloth, whispered in tones of endurance and quiet, stubborn hope. The hut exhales with you. Every time someone sighs, every time a cow shifts and huffs through its nostrils, every time a child coughs, the air thickens a little more. You sit up and realise you're inside a chamber of breathing things, human, animal, and fire alike, each exhale layering moisture into the air, each puff becoming visible in the dim light. It dances upward, ghostly, where it joins with smoke drifting lazily from the hearth. Together they tangle beneath the beams, a haze so dense that frost itself forms on the wood above. You glance up, squinting. Tiny crystals glisten in the faint firelight, delicate as lace. Each one is born from breath, the very act of living freezing in place overhead. You marvel at it, half horrified and half enchanted. The hut has become a lung, exhaling its own icy ornaments. When morning comes, those crystals will drip in cold rivulets, spattering down onto straw, cloaks, and unlucky faces. But for now, they hang suspended, glittering like a private constellation. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Smoke-filled homes were the norm in medieval Europe. Chimneys existed, but were rare among peasants. Most huts had open hearths with no proper flues. Smoke rose, curled, and lingered until it found its way out through a hole in the roof or cracks in the walls. Visitors from wealthier households often complained about the stench and sting of peasant cottages, remarking that eyes watered constantly and lungs ached within minutes. Archaeological evidence confirms it. Soot clings thick inside excavated timbers, blackened over centuries of smoky nights. You cough lightly, not from imagination but from real irritation. The smoke settles low, catching in your throat, burning your nose. And yet, oddly enough, it serves its purpose. It warms faintly by holding heat longer than air alone. It drives away insects, keeping straw beds marginally less infested. And it preserves meat hanging from beams, sausage and ham acquiring flavour and longevity in the smoke's embrace. To live in smoke was to accept its costs in exchange for these benefits. The peasants understood this balance intuitively, even if they complained as much as you do now. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some households deliberately kept their huts smoky at night, believing it would protect them from evil spirits. A heavy haze, they thought, confused witches and demons who might otherwise slip in through shutters or keyholes. The same smoke that makes your lungs ache was seen as a magical defence. Imagine dozing off with your eyes watering, half suffocated and whispering, "At least the spirits can't get me," comforting in its own warped way. You inhale again and feel the cold bite despite the smoke. The draught from the shutter mixes with human breath, creating swirls of mist that hang at head level. You reach out your hand and watch your own exhale drift into the air, mingling with everyone else's. It's intimate, unsettling, and oddly communal. Each breath becomes part of the hut, lingering long after leaving your lips. In a strange sense, you're all inside one another's lungs. Historians still argue about just how harmful this daily exposure was. Some suggest peasants developed extraordinary tolerance, their lungs toughened against constant smoke. Others believe it led to chronic illness, shortening lives in ways never directly recorded. Skeletal evidence shows signs of respiratory strain, but interpretation remains contentious. Were these people fragile, wheezing their way through life? Or were they robust, hardened by exposure in ways modern lungs would crumble under? The answer drifts like the smoke itself, hard to pin down, always shifting. The frost overhead thickens as the night deepens. Each breath adds another layer, each draft hardens it further. You imagine lying here for weeks, months, through the length of winter, watching beams drip each morning, dampening straw until it mildews, until the smell of rot mixes with smoke and dung. This isn't just one night. It's a season, repeated every year. A rhythm of breath, frost, drip, and cough, marking time the way clocks mark hours. You laugh quietly at yourself because in the middle of this discomfort you catch a thought. This is almost like camping. The kind of camping where you wake to condensation dripping on your nose, where your sleeping bag steams with your own breath. But here, there are no nylon tents, no zippered layers to shield you. Just timber, daub, and a patchwork of rags pretending to be windows. Camping, yes, but permanent and compulsory. The dog at your feet stirs, shaking its fur. A burst of warm breath escapes its muzzle, fogging the air around your ankles. For a fleeting second, the sight feels comforting. Even the animals contribute to this strange economy of breath and frost. They add their warmth, their steam, their essence to the hut. Together, human and beast weave a tapestry of survival, each exhale a thread in the fabric of the night. The fire crackles faintly, coughing up a last handful of sparks. Smoke thickens once more, a rolling wave across the rafters. You lower yourself into the straw, eyes stinging, lungs heavy, but there's no fighting it. You're part of the haze now, part of the breathing, steaming, freezing community that fills the hut. And as you drift back toward uneasy sleep, you realise winter here isn't fought with clean air and sealed walls. It's endured with smoke, breath, and frost, mingling until they are indistinguishable, until survival itself feels like inhaling the village's collective exhale. You wake again in the dim half-light, stirred not by the cold this time, but by the faint murmur of voices around you. The fire has settled to embers, the shutters rattle in their frame, and the straw crunches as bodies shift. Yet in the midst of this nightly discomfort, you notice something surprising. The bed is alive with conversation. Not hushed whispers of fear, not prayers alone, but chatter, gossip, and stories told in the dark. It strikes you that here, in this smoky hut, the bed is more than a place to collapse in exhaustion. It is a stage, one where family dramas, village news, and even business are played out beneath the pile of blankets and cloaks. You listen as the father recounts the yield of the last harvest, calculating aloud how long the grain will last. His wife interrupts, suggesting a trade with the neighbour who has too many beans but needs wool. A child asks a question, innocent and disruptive, and the grandmother chuckles before steering the story into a half-remembered tale about saints and miracles. The bed, itchy with straw and crowded with limbs, is suddenly a boardroom, a schoolhouse, and a theatre all at once. Mainstream historical accounts note that in peasant households there was no separate living room, no chamber designated for polite conversation. The hearth and the bed served multiple purposes. They were spaces for rest, work, storytelling, and planning. In many regions, letters and chronicles describe peasants negotiating marriages or inheritance while still under the covers, the night providing both privacy and intimacy. This space wasn't compartmentalised. Sleep mingled with speech, warmth, with wit. You roll onto your side and watch as one child, eyes wide despite the hour, begs for a story. The grandmother obliges, her voice raspy, weaving a tale about a knight who wandered too far into a frozen forest. The knight, she says, found shelter by sharing a cave with a bear, and only survived because he learned to breathe in rhythm with the animal. The children giggle, clutching at each other, while the adults exchange knowing glances. The lesson is practical, survival through closeness, disguised as entertainment. Even in stories, the bed becomes a classroom. Here's a quirky tidbit you can't help but grin at. In some regions, peasants refer to their straw piles as the council. Not formally, of course, but jokingly. because so many important matters ended up being discussed there. The decision to plant barley instead of rye, the rumour that the reeve was skimming grain from tithes, the whispered hope that spring might come early. These conversations unfolded with toes pressed together and blankets pulled to chins. Imagine a modern city council convening in pyjamas under a shared quilt. The absurdity makes you chuckle, but for them, it was natural. Historians still argue whether this blurring of sleep and social life was typical across Europe or more localised. Some argue the bed's communal nature encouraged conversation, making it a hub of family life. Others suggest exhaustion from daily labour would have silenced most chatter, with people falling unconscious the moment they lay down. The evidence is patchy: snippets in diaries, anecdotes from visiting clerics, folklore passed down. You can almost hear the scholars bickering over the question: did peasants gossip themselves to sleep, or were they too weary for words? The truth, as always, may be both. You lie back and close your eyes, letting the voices flow around you. There's laughter when the father recounts a neighbour's mishap with a pig that ran loose through the churchyard. There's tension when someone mutters about taxes due to the Lord. There's tenderness when the mother hums softly to soothe her restless child. The bed creaks, straw shifts, but the talk never ceases. In a village where daylight hours are consumed by toil, night offers the rare luxury of conversation. Even if the cold gnaws at every corner, the stories knit the family tighter than any blanket could. You think of modern beds. Space is often treated as sanctuaries for silence, intimacy, or solitude. Compare that to this: a communal slab where every breath, joke and complaint is shared. It feels alien and yet oddly appealing. The boundaries between waking and sleeping blur. The night becomes both rest and communion. Perhaps this is what makes the bed a stage. It is a liminal place, neither fully active nor fully dormant, where truths slip out as easily as snores. The grandmother begins another tale, this one about a mischievous fox who stole bread from a miller. She embellishes shamelessly, turning the fox into a trickster who outwits not only the miller, but the parish priest. The children giggle until their shoulders shake, and even the father cracks a grin. You realise you're witnessing something precious. The cold may still creep through the shutters, fleas may still bite in the straw, but here, laughter warms more than any cloak. A chicken stirs in the corner, clucking softly, and the dog lets out a sigh as though tired of the noise. The hut is alive with layers of sound. Fire popping, shutters rattling, animals shifting, people talking. And through it all, the bed remains the centre, the stage where life unfolds in miniature. Your eyes grow heavy again, lulled not by silence but by chatter. You feel the warmth of bodies, hear the cadence of familiar voices, and realise that this nightly ritual isn't just about surviving winter. It's about remembering who you are, binding yourself to others with words and warmth, using the bed not merely as a shield against the cold, but as a place where life itself continues to pulse. And as you drift back into half-sleep, you wonder if perhaps the greatest secret of these medieval nights is this: the bed was never just for sleeping. It was for living, together, in the face of the freezing dark. The hut has quieted again. The chatter has ebbed. The children's laughter softened into snores, and the only sound left is the intermittent crackle of a stubborn ember refusing to die. Yet as you lie back into the straw, wrapped in itchy layers and pressed against bodies on either side, you become aware of another presence, silence heavy with imagination. The medieval night, after all, was not merely cold, it was haunted. For peasants, darkness was never neutral. Every creak of the timbers, every rattle of the shutter, every moan of the wind outside became an invitation for the mind to wander. You close your eyes and suddenly hear it too. Whispers of forces beyond your sight, shapes moving just outside the glow of the embers. The dog growls faintly in its sleep and your skin prickles. You know, of course, that the animal is dreaming, but in this world, dreams themselves might be omens. Mainstream historians often remind us that medieval Europe was a place steeped in fear of the supernatural. Nighttime especially belonged to demons, witches, and restless spirits. Church sermons and popular tales alike reinforced this belief. The cold season magnified it, as long nights stretched endlessly, and the thin walls of cottages left little defence against either nature or nightmare. To lie awake in the dark was to lie open to invisible visitors. You shift in the straw, listening, and the grandmother stirs again. This time her voice is low, almost a mutter, reciting a prayer half in Latin, half in the local tongue. It is less about piety and more about protection, an invisible shield cast over the sleepers. She crosses herself, then tucks the blanket higher over the children, as if layering faith atop wool. You realise that for these people, superstition was not decoration. It was survival, as vital as cloaks or firewood. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you shiver and smile all at once. Some peasants smeared protective symbols onto shutters, using ash from the hearth, believing the marks would confuse evil spirits. Others hung herbs like rowan or juniper above their doors, thought to repel witches. In the depths of winter, when wolves howled and frost clawed at the windows, a sprig of greenery might feel as potent as a sword. You imagine lying here, breathing in smoke, scratching at fleas and thinking, yes, but at least the juniper will keep the devil out. The air in the hut feels heavier now, though you know it's your imagination layering meaning onto draughts and creaks. Historians still argue about the depth of belief in such superstitions. Were peasants genuinely terrified of every shadow, or did they treat these tales more like cultural wallpaper? Stories told, charms hung, but life carried on regardless. Some argue that fear of witches was exaggerated later during inquisitions. Others insist that in the deep, dark cold, belief was as real as the frost on the beams. Perhaps it depended on the night, the person, or how loudly the wind screamed outside. A log outside shifts under snow, making a dull thud. You freeze, heart racing, even though you know the explanation is simple. Yet you understand how easily such sounds could become footsteps in the imagination, how a gust of wind could become a whisper, how frost cracking in the rafters could mimic claws. The medieval night was a theatre of fear, and the mind, deprived of light, became the playwright. A child whimpers beside you, caught in a dream. His mother murmurs softly, stroking his hair, whispering a lullaby about angels standing guard at the door. The melody is fragile, almost drowned by the rattling shutter, but it steadies the boy. You feel yourself comforted too, though the words aren't meant for you. Songs and prayers acted as nightly rituals, weaving psychological armour for the long stretch until dawn. And yet, despite the fear, there is something oddly beautiful in this world of superstition. It bound the community together as surely as body heat did. If one neighbour claimed to see a spirit, others listened. If a child cried at night, the whole household murmured prayers. The night may have belonged to imagined demons, but it also belonged to shared rituals of protection, whispered together under the same roof. You curl deeper into the straw, eyes tracing the frost overhead. The crystals sparkle faintly in the dying glow of the fire, like stars arranged by some unseen hand. For a moment, you think of the peasants who lay here centuries before, gazing upward just as you do now, layering their fears and hopes into the frost. Perhaps they too wondered if the world beyond the shutter was filled with spirits, or if the only real demon was the cold. A draught snakes across your face, and you shiver. You tug the cloak tighter, nestling closer to the bodies beside you. The grandmother's mutter has faded, the child's breathing is steady, and the hut is once again filled only with the rhythm of sleep. Yet the air is alive with possibility, with the stories people tell themselves to make sense of the dark. And as your own eyes grow heavy again, you realise that here, superstition is not folly. It is warmth for the mind, a way of turning fear into narrative, of surviving the endless winter nights not just in body but in spirit. The night lingers, stretched thin across hours that feel endless, and you notice a shift in rhythm. Before settling fully into sleep, the father of the household stirs, fumbling in the shadows near the hearth. You hear the faint scrape of clay against stone, then the glug-glug of liquid being poured. A faint yeasty scent wafts through the smoke-heavy air, cutting across the tang of straw and animals. It is ale, not the golden frothy beverage you imagine from modern pubs, but the cloudy, low-strength drink of the medieval peasant. And in this moment, it is as much a part of survival as cloaks and fire. He takes a swig, sighs deeply, and passes the vessel along. The mother takes a sip, then the grandmother. Even the older children are offered a taste, though the little ones are spared. You watch as the clay cup makes its rounds, each mouthful a brief warmth in the throat, a mellowing of nerves, a soft curtain dropping over the day's hardships. The mainstream historical fact here is simple. Medieval ale was a staple, not a luxury. Brewed weak, it was safer than water, which often carried illness from rivers, wells, or streams. Ale contained enough alcohol to kill off some bacteria, but not enough to intoxicate heavily when consumed in moderation. Families drank it daily, adults and children alike, though the youngest usually received watered-down versions. And at night, in winter, it doubled as a lullaby in liquid form. You take an imaginary sip yourself, letting the idea of it linger on your tongue. It would be thick, perhaps gritty, flavoured with whatever grains were available, sometimes spiced with herbs if luck permitted. Not the crisp pint you know, but more like liquid bread. Hearty, filling, and practical. It dulls the sharp edge of hunger, warms the belly, and loosens the stiffness in limbs knotted from labour. You begin to see why this nightly ritual made sense. Sleep, already fragile in the cold, came easier with a cup of ale in hand. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you grin in the dimness. Some villages brewed special night ale, a batch deliberately weaker, meant solely to ease the transition to bed. It was consumed in larger gulps, like a peasant's version of hot cocoa. The thought makes you laugh, imagining parents calling out, "Children, fetch the night ale, time for bed." And though no marshmallows floated on its surface, the purpose was the same, a comforting drink to soften the edges of the day. As the cup passes back to the father, he sets it down carefully, making sure no drops spill. Grain is precious, nothing can be wasted. You realise that this act is more than indulgence, it's calculation. A portion of the harvest is set aside for brewing, balance between the need for calories and the need for liquid safety. To drink ale at night is to participate in a centuries-old economy of survival. Historians still debate just how alcoholic these brews were. Some argue that small ale contained less than 2% alcohol, hardly stronger than modern kombucha. Others suggest stronger batches were common, particularly when harvests were plentiful. The truth likely varied by region and season. What's clear is that peasants used ale not merely for merriment, but as medicine, nourishment, and comfort. To dismiss it as simple beer drinking misses the point. It was woven into the very fabric of existence. The grandmother wipes her mouth and mutters a blessing under her breath. The children giggle, mimicking her words, though their voices trail off in sleep before they finish. The warmth of ale has done its work, softening the fear of draughts, masking the bitterness of hunger, nudging heavy eyes toward dreams. Even you feel the effect, though you've only borrowed the imagination of it. Your limbs feel heavier, your mind slower, lulled by the idea of a drink thick with grain and hearth smoke. A memory surfaces. Someone once wrote that ale was liquid comfort against the night. You smile at the aptness of it. These peasants may not have known chemistry, but they knew the alchemy of survival. Water could kill, but ale sustained. Hunger gnawed, but ale filled. Cold threatened, but ale dulled the sting. It was a potion brewed not by wizards, but by women at their tubs, stirring, straining, hoping the yeast would catch. The hut grows quieter as the vessel is set aside, the family sinking deeper into the straw. The dog sighs, the cow shifts, the goat curls tighter. You feel your own eyelids heavy, your breath fogging faintly in the smoky dark. The ale has woven itself into the fabric of the night, not as excess, but as necessity, a small comfort offered in a world with so few. And as you drift towards sleep again, you realise that this nightly cup is more than habit. It is ritual. It is reassurance. It is the village's way of saying, yes, the cold is bitter. Yes, the night is long. But here, sip and let it go. You had almost surrendered to the heaviness of sleep. Your limbs slack, your breathing steady, your mind drifting into that strange twilight state where dreams nibble at the edges, when the illusion of rest is shattered. A sound splits the silence, sharp and unwelcome. It is not the wind this time, nor the occasional crackle of the hearth. It is the unmistakable bellow of the cow in the corner, restless, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps hungry. The sound reverberates through the tiny hut, shaking you awake along with everyone else. A groan rises from the father as he rolls out of the straw, muttering curses under his breath. He lumbers toward the animal, bare feet slapping against the hard-packed earth, cloak dragging behind him. The cow shifts, lowing again, and he strokes its side, whispering a soft reprimand as though calming a child. You sit up and realise quickly, medieval nights were never truly restful. Interruptions were as common as dreams. Mainstream historians agree that peasants rarely enjoyed uninterrupted slumber. Livestock often shared the same space, and their noises, the bleats, clucks, snorts, and scratches, were inescapable. Add to that the constant demands of small children, the groans of the elderly, and the barking of dogs at imagined threats outside, and you begin to see how fragile the concept of peaceful sleep was. The bed was a battlefield not only against cold but against chaos. As the father tends to the cow, another sound emerges, the shuffle of a child sitting up, rubbing eyes, muttering about hunger. The mother soothes her quickly, reaching for a small loaf set aside earlier, tearing off a hunk and handing it over. The crunch of teeth on stale bread fills the air, oddly loud against the silence. Hunger did not keep to daylight hours. Stomachs growled at night, and those who could spare a crumb did so. You imagine how comforting that rough piece of bread must feel against the child's tongue, even if it is dry as bark. Here's a quirky tidbit you can't help but smirk at. Chamber pots, though vital, were also nightly culprits in breaking sleep. Imagine the indignity of fumbling in the dark, squatting over a clay pot while your entire family dozes mere inches away. The sounds, the smells, intimacy at its most unromantic. And yet it was practical. Better the chamber pot than braving wolves, snow, or spirits outside the hut. You hear one such pot now, the scrape of clay being moved, the awkward shuffle as someone makes use of it. Privacy was a luxury left to nobles. Peasants relieved themselves where they slept, as matter of fact as breathing. Historians still debate whether segmented sleep, the idea of two distinct first and second sleeps separated by a waking period, was universal. Some scholars claim peasants followed this pattern, waking in the middle of the night for prayer, chores, or even socialising before drifting back into slumber. Others argue it may have been more common in urban households or monasteries, while rural folk simply endured restless, broken sleep without structure. The evidence comes from scattered references in diaries, letters and sermons, leaving modern scholars to squabble. As you sit here, listening to the cow, the child, the chamber pot, you think, who needed a second sleep when interruptions came uninvited every night? The grandmother stirs now, coughing wetly, a sound that rattles her chest. She fumbles for the blanket, pulling it over her head, as though that could shield her from her own lungs. Coughing was part of life, part of the soundtrack of every hut. Smoke-filled air, damp straw, cold draughts. Together they conspired against breathing. You wonder how many nights ended with prayers that such coughs would fade by spring rather than deepen into something fatal. The interruptions continue like a grim parade. A dog barks suddenly, jolting everyone awake, convinced that some intruder lurks outside. The father peers through the shutter crack, sees nothing but snow, and returns grumbling. The baby cries, soothed only after being fed at the mother's breast, her soft humming rising over the din. Another child kicks in his sleep, striking his sister, who wakes with a squeal and a shove. You marvel at the chaos of it all, at how little chance there was for deep, dreamless rest. And yet, the resilience is astonishing. Each interruption is handled without drama, with the ease of routine. A loaf here, a pat on the cow there, a lullaby hummed, a cough muffled. These people do not curse the night or pine for uninterrupted rest. They adapt. Nighttime is not a sanctuary but an extension of life itself, full of duties and demands. Sleep comes in fragments, in fits and starts, patched together like the ragged cloak you clutch around yourself. You lean back, listening to the rhythm return. The child gnaws quietly on her bread, the baby suckles, the cow finally settles, and the grandmother's cough softens into snores. The interruptions fade into background noise once more. You realise that in this world, rest was not about silence or solitude. It was about weaving sleep between disturbances, about catching what peace you could in the gaps left by hunger, animals and bodies. A thought crosses your mind. How would modern people react to such a night? Conditioned by alarms, mattresses and blackout curtains, they would find it intolerable. Yet here, peasants knew no alternative. The chaos was life. The bed was stage, shield and stable all at once, and sleep was a fragile thread woven through interruptions. You chuckle softly at the absurdity of complaining about a neighbour's leaf blower back home. Here, a cow's bellow or a chamber pot splash is the lullaby. You curl deeper into the straw, eyes half closed, hearts softened by the realization. Yes, the night is noisy, messy, restless, but still people drift back into dreams one by one, surrendering to the rhythm of interruption and recovery. And perhaps, in its own rough way, that is peace, not the absence of disturbance, but the persistence of sleep despite it. You shift beneath the mound of cloaks and straw, half awake, half lulled by the rhythm of snores and shifting bodies. The thought creeps into your mind. Not everyone in the medieval world endured winter nights quite like this. Beyond the village fields, past the manor, and through winding roads lies another kind of cold chamber. Stone, not timber. Disciplined, not chaotic. The monastery. And though monks were spared some hardships of peasant huts, their nights were in many ways harsher still. You imagine yourself suddenly transported into such a place. Thick walls rising from the earth, their stones icy to the touch, mortared with frost. The dormitory stretches long and narrow, lined with simple pallets of wood or straw sacks, one for each brother. No women, no children, no dogs curled at feet or cows warming the corners. Only men bound together by prayer, silence and discipline. The draught is merciless here, seeping straight through the stone, and the absence of animals makes the air cleaner but far colder. Mainstream historians note how monastic architecture was designed to emphasize austerity. Heat was not a priority, devotion was. Monks were expected to embrace discomfort as a form of spiritual discipline, a bodily reminder of mortality. Cloisters and dormitories rarely had hearths, and if they did, the flames were small, insufficient to heat vast chambers. Many orders required their brothers to sleep in their habits, hoods pulled low, belts fastened, ready to rise for prayer at any hour. Comfort was considered indulgence, endurance was virtue. You tug your cloak tighter, half in sympathy, half in disbelief. Imagine lying on a wooden plank covered by a thin straw mat, no family to cuddle against, no ale to dull the edge, only silence broken by the shuffle of robes, or the faint cough of another weary soul. And yet, for the monks, this was not misery but meaning. To them the cold was an ally, sharpening focus, keeping the body subdued while the soul reached for the divine. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you blink in the smoky dark. Some orders forbade fires altogether in sleeping quarters, even in the harshest winters. Instead, monks were expected to warm themselves only with prayer and the rhythm of communal chant. Records tell of ice forming on water jugs left by their beds, frost crusting their blankets, even ink freezing in their inkwells. Yet the brothers endured, believing that discomfort purified them, separating their purpose from the indulgence of the world. You glance around the peasant hut again, suddenly struck by the contrast. Here, chaos reigns. Dogs bark, children stir, cows grunt. There in the monastery, silence rules. But silence does not mean peace. It means submission to a higher order, a willingness to exchange warmth for faith. Historians still argue whether such discipline inspired admiration among layfolk or seemed absurd. Some chronicles suggest villagers looked up to monks as holy men braving the elements with divine aid. Others hint at skepticism, noting how quickly monks accepted gifts of fur-lined cloaks from wealthy patrons when they could. The comparison lingers in your mind. Peasants pressed close in heaps of straw, sharing warmth indiscriminately. Monks lay apart, each in his place, united by vows but separated by stone and discipline. The peasant hut was messy, smelly, noisy, but it was human, alive with chatter, gossip and laughter. The monastery dormitory was austere, disciplined, almost lifeless, the hum of prayer replacing the hum of family. Two different ways of surviving the same winter, two philosophies embodied in stone and straw. You think of how each system shaped its sleepers. A child raised in a hut grew used to interruptions, warmth stolen from animals and comfort traded for closeness. A novice in a monastery learned stillness, obedience, and the art of ignoring shivering limbs. Both produced resilience, but of different kinds, one rooted in communal survival, the other in spiritual discipline. You smirk quietly at a thought. Imagine swapping the two. Peasants forced into monastic dorms, forbidden to cuddle with kin or bring in goats, grumbling at the absurdity. Monks thrust into straw heaps with bleating animals, scandalized by the noise and earthy intimacy. The clash would be comic, though perhaps both sides might secretly envy the other's small advantages. The hut creaks, the shutter rattles again, and you are pulled back fully into the smoky present. A child kicks in his sleep, the dog shifts, the cow sighs heavily, and you realise that while monastic austerity had its own severity, you prefer this chaos. It is warmer, fuller, messier, but it feels alive, and so you lie back down, breathing in smoke, straw, and the musk of animals, grateful that your winter night belongs not to stone austerity, but to the tangled humanity of the peasant bed. The monks may have chosen silence and discipline, but here, among snores and murmurs, you find a different kind of holiness. Survival shared, endured together, in defiance of the cold. You stir again, blinking against the smoke haze that clings to the rafters, and for a fleeting moment you imagine what lies just beyond this hut. Not across oceans, not in faraway lands, but a short walk up the hill, the manor house, the lord's residence, where winter nights unfold in a vastly different key. The contrast is jarring, almost cruel. Here you scratch fleas, cough smoke, and share your straw with a cow. There, across the estate, the nobility rest on feather beds beneath fur covers, their chambers warmed by braziers of glowing coals. You can picture it. A stone hall with heavy wooden shutters fitted tight against the wind, tapestries hanging thick along the walls to trap heat and flaunt wealth. A nobleman lies sprawled on a bedstead carved with intricate designs, its mattress stuffed with goose down. Over him, blankets of wool, silk and fur layer like trophies of conquest. At his side, perhaps a small brazier glows, embers feeding heat into the room without filling it with choking smoke. Compare that to the coughing, wheezing and scratching around you, and the gulf yawns wider than the distance between hut and hall. Mainstream history makes the disparity plain. While peasants endured draughty cottages, nobles invested in comfort. Beds were symbols of status as much as tools of rest. Inventories of noble estates list feather beds, sheets of fine linen, and fur-trimmed covers among prized possessions. These weren't just bedding, they were heirlooms, passed down, displayed, flaunted. A noble's chamber was designed to impress, even in the dark of night. And though stone walls could be cold, the layers of wealth compensated. Servants, too, ensured fires were fed, coals replenished, and chamber pots discreetly emptied. Interruptions the peasant family had to handle themselves. You imagine yourself slipping quietly into such a chamber, running your hand along the fur of a coverlet. Fox, perhaps, or ermine if the lord was very rich. It is soft, lush, and warm in a way that no patched cloak could ever be. You can't help but grin wryly at the unfairness of it. Just a few hundred steps separate worlds. One family huddled in straw, another draped in fur. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you raise an eyebrow. Some nobles employed bed warmers, servants who would slip heated pans of coals between the sheets before their masters retired. Imagine lying down not on icy linen but on cloth already warm, as if the bed itself welcomed you, a luxury so simple and yet so unattainable to those who lay shivering in smoke-filled huts. The irony isn't lost on you. Peasants begged for a warm ember to relight the hearth, while nobles placed embers in their mattresses. Historians still argue about the true extent of noble comfort. Some claim that even castles and manors were draughty, with stone walls radiating cold and vast halls impossible to heat fully. Others emphasise that nobles had layers of advantage, better bedding, more fuel, and servants to maintain fires through the night. The debate continues. Were noble beds paradises of warmth, or were they simply less miserable than peasant huts? The truth, as always, may lie in between. Yet compared to the hut you lie in now, even a less miserable noble chamber feels like paradise. You glance at the straw bed around you, hear the soft moan of a child stirring, smell the pungent mix of smoke, sweat, and dung. Then you imagine the quiet rustle of silk sheets, the glow of a private brazier, the soft murmur of servants standing by. The disparity is sharp enough to sting. It reminds you that winter was not an equalizer, it was a divider. The cold punished peasants harshly, while wealth bought not just food and firewood but rest itself. And yet, you sense another truth lingering beneath the envy. For all their comforts, nobles lived more isolated nights. Their beds, though softer, were lonelier. Separated chambers, layers of luxury but fewer layers of kin. The peasants' night was shared in straw heaps of warmth and chatter. The nobles' was spent in chambers quieter, more private, but perhaps colder in spirit. You wonder, just for a moment, which kind of night felt heavier, the chaotic warmth of the hut or the silken solitude of the hall. A log shifts in the hearth, sending sparks upward, and you're pulled back into the smoky reality around you. The hut is noisy, crowded, draughty, yet it is alive, pulsing with breath and warmth. The manor house looms only in imagination, its feather beds and fur blankets tantalizing but distant. And you realize, lying back into the straw, that while the noble's comfort was enviable, it was not your reality. Your night belongs here, to smoke and straw, to shared warmth and restless sleep. Still, as you close your eyes, you can't resist the thought. What you wouldn't give, just for one night, to feel the weight of a fur cover instead of a flea-ridden cloak. The hut has grown eerily still. The embers in the hearth glow faintly, but their warmth has retreated to a meagre halo around the stones. You shift beneath the patched cloaks, feeling the brittle edge of the cold creeping back in. Your breath fogs heavily, and for a moment you imagine what it would mean if the fire went out completely, if the food supply dwindled, if the cold was not simply discomfort but death, waiting with patient claws. The medieval winter was not only a season of hardship, it was often a season of hunger. Crops harvested in autumn had to last until spring, and when stores ran low, families rationed bread, stretched broth, and prayed for mercy. You can almost hear the growl of empty stomachs in the straw around you, the whispered counting of remaining sacks of grain, the silent fear of scarcity. A winter night with an empty belly feels twice as long. Hunger gnaws not only at the stomach, but at the will to endure. The mainstream historical record confirms the cycle. Good harvests brought relief, but bad harvests brought famine, and famine paired with cold was devastating. Accounts from the harsh winters of the 14th century describe entire villages weakened by hunger, some reduced to eating bark, roots, or even straw itself in desperation. Diseases followed closely behind, preying on weakened bodies. Malnutrition made peasants more vulnerable to infections, and when the frost set in, it was not just comfort that vanished, but lives. You curl deeper into the heap of bodies and feel a child's thin arm draped across your chest. His bones are sharp, his skin taut. The reality strikes you with a pang. Not everyone here will survive the winter. The cold culls the weakest, the very old, the very young, the already sick. Winter takes them first, wrapping them in frost. Those who endure carry the memories of lost kin into spring, memories etched as deeply as the frostbite scars on their limbs. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels both grim and oddly practical. Some villages kept what they called famine breads, loaves baked with fillers like ground acorns, tree bark, or even powdered fern root. The taste was bitter, sometimes poisonous in large amounts, but it provided bulk enough to fool a stomach for a while. You can picture a mother breaking such a loaf at midnight, handing out shards as brittle as kindling, whispering, "Eat and sleep." Survival made pragmatists of everyone. Frostbite was another predator of the night. You glance at the feet poking out from beneath the cloaks, toes bare or poorly wrapped in rags. Cold bites extremities first, blackening flesh, numbing fingers, stiffening limbs. Historians still debate how widespread frostbite injuries were among peasants. Skeletal remains sometimes show signs of amputations, but it is unclear whether these were medical interventions or the crude outcome of untreated injuries. What is certain is that exposure to such bitter cold left lasting marks. Every night peasants wade the thin line between endurance and injury. The father stirs in the straw, rubbing his hands together fiercely before tucking them beneath his arms. He mutters something about the dwindling firewood, his voice tight with worry. Every log is a calculation. Burn too much tonight, and there will be none left next week. Burn too little, and the frost might slip into your lungs before dawn. The math of survival is cruel, and it never sleeps. You think of the noble's manor again, with its featherbeds and braziers, and the contrast feels sharper than ever. Hunger and frost seldom killed the wealthy. For the peasant, they were constant companions, stalking every night, waiting for weakness to show. And yet, you also feel awe at the resilience on display. Families endured this for centuries, binding themselves tighter, improvising, sharing every crumb and ember. A memory surfaces from a chronicle. One winter was so severe that people huddled in barns with their livestock, not just for warmth, but because the animals were their only remaining wealth. "Better to freeze with the cow than to lose it," one farmer wrote. It sounds absurd until you realise that losing the cow meant losing milk, labour and security. Hunger and frostbite did not just steal bodies, they threatened futures. You pull your cloak higher, nestling against the warmth of others, and feel your heart tighten at the thought of how fragile it all is. A missed harvest, a bitter storm, a single illness, each could tilt the balance fatally. Historians still argue whether peasants lived in perpetual crisis, or whether these extremes were occasional tragedies. But lying here, in the thick of smoke and straw, you suspect the truth. Winter was always a gamble. Some years merciful, some years cruel, but never to be trusted. A child coughs beside you, thin and weak, and the grandmother hums a soft tune to soothe him. It is not enough to feed him, not enough to warm him, but enough to remind him that he is not alone, and perhaps that, in the face of famine and frostbite, is the greatest weapon peasants had. Endurance not of the body alone, but of the spirit, carried in song, story, and the stubborn refusal to let the cold win without a fight. As you drift back toward uneasy slumber, you realise that every winter night was a negotiation with death. Hunger and frostbite were always at the door, yet somehow, year after year, families endured, children grew, spring returned. And in that fragile continuity lies the quiet triumph of the medieval peasant, not conquering the cold, but surviving it long enough to see the thaw. The hours drag on, and as you lie half waking in the smoky dark, a peculiar rhythm of time reveals itself. This is not the solid block of 8 hours that modern people chase with blackout curtains and alarm clocks. No, your night comes in waves. You fall into sleep, you wake to coughs or cattle, you drift again, then stir once more. Soon you realise that this fractured pattern is not failure. It is the natural cadence of a medieval winter night. Mainstream historians speak of segmented sleep, a practice widely observed before the invention of artificial lighting. People often spoke of a first sleep and second sleep, divided by a waking interval that might last an hour or two. During this middle-of-the-night vigil, families might whisper prayers, mend clothes, tend to the fire, even check on livestock. In some records, neighbours used the interval to visit one another quietly, as if the world itself had granted them a secret pocket of time. You feel it now, the way your body doesn't resist waking, but accepts it as part of the night's flow. You sit up in the straw and glance around. A few others stir, eyes blinking in the dimness, their breaths fogging in pale plumes. The father pokes at the hearth, coaxing the embers with a sigh. The mother adjusts her child's cloak, murmuring softly. The grandmother mutters a prayer, as if to sanctify this in-between hour. It is not disruption. It is rhythm. A long winter night is simply too vast to cross in one unbroken stretch. Sleep comes in chapters. Here's a quirky tidbit to amuse you. Some medical texts from the period suggested that this middle waking was an excellent time for, shall we say, marital duties. Couples were advised that their bodies were more rested and ready during the interval between sleeps. Imagine that. Science of the day encouraging midnight intimacy while the wind howled outside. The thought makes you smile in the gloom, though you glance around at the crowd of family and livestock and wonder where, exactly, privacy could have been found. Historians still argue about how widespread segmented sleep truly was. Some claim it was nearly universal before industrialization forced strict schedules. Others suggest it may have been more common among certain classes or regions, while peasants simply endured broken slumber without recognizing a pattern. Diaries and court records reference first sleep and second sleep, but were these elite habits or shared by all? The debate lingers, unresolved. But in this smoky hut where the night stretches impossibly long, the logic of 2 sleeps feels undeniable. You settle back into the straw, watching the dance of frost on the rafters as the fire is coaxed back into life. The father adds a few twigs and a lick of flame leaps up, painting faces in amber light. For a brief while the hut feels alive again. Eyes gleaming, voices murmuring, chores attended. A child is given a crust of bread. A pot is shifted closer to the fire. The dog is nudged when it growls too loudly. Life resumes, not as if morning has come, but as if the night itself has offered a recess. It strikes you how different this is from modern rest. Today we treat waking at 2 a.m. as failure, insomnia, a problem to be fixed. Here it is expected, woven into the fabric of survival. This waking hour is a time to guard against frost, to stir embers, to pray for health, to listen for wolves outside. Far from wasted time, it is a vital interlude, the hinge that allows the night to open into two halves. A story comes to you, one whispered in villages about the Watchers, people who roamed during this interval, ensuring neighbours had not lost their fires. They would carry embers in covered pots, knocking softly at doors, offering flame where it had died. The Watchers became almost mythical, guardians of warmth in the coldest hours. You can imagine the relief of a family woken by a knock, finding their fire rekindled by a neighbour's kindness. The hut quiets again as chores are finished. The father settles back into the straw. The mother hushes her child. The grandmother drifts into another prayer that fades into a snore. Slowly, the second wave of sleep takes hold. You feel it tug at your limbs, heavier than before, more insistent. Your body surrenders willingly, knowing the fire has been fed, the children tucked, the dangers checked. This second sleep is deeper, darker, almost like sinking into the earth itself. As your eyes close, you realise how profoundly human this rhythm is. Sleep shaped not by clocks, but by the cycle of firelight and darkness, hunger and rest, fear and relief. In winter, the night was too vast to cross in one stride. It demanded 2 steps, 2 sleeps, with a breath of waking in between. And somehow that broken rhythm feels whole. The second sleep loosens its hold, and you rise slowly toward waking. The hut is still dark, though a faint paling creeps into the shutter cracks. Morning is near, but not here yet. Bodies shift around you. A child murmurs, a dog stretches, the grandmother coughs into her blanket. The night has been long, exhausting, full of interruptions, but you are still here. That in itself feels like victory. You look around at the family tangled in straw and cloaks, animals pressed close, the hearth still smouldering with one last ember. Each face is weary, chapped, marked by cold and smoke. Yet each face also breathes. They have endured another night, not by strength alone, but by clinging to each other, by pressing warmth against warmth, by pooling their breaths into a shared survival. Mainstream historians remind us that the essence of medieval peasant life was not the individual, but the collective. Families, neighbours, and villages endured winter as units, not as solitary figures. The hut you've been lying in is proof of that truth. One fire, one bed, one breath shared among many. Survival was communal, never private. You smile faintly, despite the itch of fleas and the sting of smoke, because you recognise something deeply human in this arrangement. The cold outside may have been merciless, but within these flimsy walls there is warmth born of stubborn companionship. People sang together, prayed together, told stories together, and yes, slept together. The cold was not defeated, but it was resisted, made bearable by togetherness. Here's a quirky tidbit to leave lingering in your mind. In some villages, families would gather in a single hall for festivals during winter, sleeping side by side with neighbours, livestock and strangers alike. It wasn't just about merriment, it was about conserving heat, about letting the press of bodies turn celebration into insulation. Imagine the cacophony, snoring men, gossiping women, goats bleating, children giggling under cloaks. Chaotic, loud and smelly, but ultimately life-affirming. Historians still wrestle with how peasants truly felt about these winters. Were they miserable, cursing the cold each night, dreaming of summer, or were they simply accustomed, accepting hardship as natural, neither dwelling on nor romanticising it? Some argue that constant exposure dulled the edge of suffering. Others suggest that complaints litter medieval records precisely because people hated it as much as you would. The answer remains elusive, a debate suspended like frost on rafters. Yet here, immersed in the straw heap, you sense the truth lies not in misery or indifference, but in endurance. The night was hard, but not impossible, because it was endured together. The father stirs now, sitting up, stretching stiff limbs. He pokes the fire to life, adding a precious log. The mother rises too, pulling a child closer as she shakes straw from her cloak. Soon, the room is alive with motion. Animals roused, children yawning, the grandmother muttering another prayer. Dawn creeps in. hesitant but steady, and with it comes relief. One more night has been survived. You lean back, smiling at the scene. It is not glamorous, not comfortable, not free of suffering, but it is profoundly human. Against famine, against frostbite, against draughts, smoke, fleas and fear, they endured. Not alone, but bound together in the stubborn determination to make it through the night. And so the story closes, not with victory over the cold, but with the quiet triumph of endurance. The peasants did not conquer winter, they survived it, shoulder to shoulder, night after night, until spring returned. And in that survival, in that shared breath and shared warmth, lies a resilience that whispers across centuries. You're never meant to endure the cold alone. So here we are, at the end of the long winter night. The fire has dwindled to embers, the frost still clings to the beams, but dawn waits at the shutters, ready to slip through. You can feel it, can't you? The weight of the night lifting, the edge of the cold softening just enough to remind you that daylight always returns, no matter how endless the dark might seem. Let yourself breathe slower now. Imagine the hush of the village in those first hours of morning, the crunch of snow under boots, the lowing of cattle, the faint caw of crows overhead. Life stirs again, simple and steady. The peasants you've been lying beside rise and stretch, rub their eyes, shake straw from their clothes. They are tired, stiff, but alive, and that is enough. Notice how your body feels under the blankets in your own room, warmer, softer, freer than theirs ever was. Appreciate the stillness around you, the silence unmarred by cows or coughing, the clean air you draw easily into your lungs. You've travelled far into the past tonight, but now it's time to return, to sink into the safety of your own bed. Let the images of smoke and straw fade into the background. Let the chatter, the superstitions, the drafty shutters all dissolve into memory. What lingers instead is the knowledge of resilience, the quiet reminder that even in the harshest winters, people found ways to endure, together. So close your eyes, breathe deep, feel the warmth you have, the peace you've earned. The night is long, yes, but every night gives way to morning, and in that certainty, you can rest easy now.